So as Peter alluded, I last was here in '97, and the occasion of that was John Shen was supposed to be the keynote speaker that year, and he's most well known as a pulse diagnostician that led to the Shen hammer system that Leon Hammer wrote about. What happened was that Dr. Shen got sick shortly before he was supposed to come over to do the keynote speech, and I got an emergency call, could I please come and fill in for him? And that was back in the days when I think I would honestly say I knew almost less about pulse diagnosis than any other aspect of Oriental medicine. But fate works in strange ways. In the intervening time, I've become more and more interested in pulse diagnosis, and the recent publication that Peter mentioned is actually my own synthesis of various styles from around the world, which takes a quite different approach to pulse diagnosis than the Shen hammer system. But because Dr. Shen essentially, I think, represented a very rational approach to Oriental medicine, I would like to dedicate my presentation today, and actually tomorrow too, to his memory. He really contributed an awful lot, and there are several themes that that suggests to me, the first of which is, and it came up again in Nora's introductory remarks this morning, the idea of what do we practice as acupuncture practitioners. Are we artisans? Are we scientists? Are we doing something that's, the topic of this weekend's conference is the spirit, Shen, but is that something that's amenable to rational interpretation, or is it in that kind of religious field? And so one of the questions I'd like to actually start out with is, and I'm very happy if there's some sort of interactive stuff going on in the room, is Oriental medicine primarily a scientific or science-based endeavor, or is it something else? Is it of another sort? If anybody has an opinion about it, that's fine to kick in, otherwise I'll just jump into my presentation. So I'm fine with people interrupting me, raising your hands, whatever. It's perfectly all right. So let's look at the first slide here. That's good. So this is from, I'm going to grab this. This is from Ling Shu 73, which is, as you know, part of the Neijing. And what it's saying there is methods and laws. We have a clicker here. So methods and laws with regard to past ancients. So the idea is that this is the tradition. Verify, it's over here, this character here, which means to test or prove with regard to arriving at the present day. This was a translation of chapter 73 by Andy Prescott, who actually used to live around Daventry. So he emailed me this after reading the prospectus that I put out for what I was going to talk about a few days ago, this last week. And I said, great, this would be a great introduction. There's some kind of resonance going on with him sending me this and having lived right nearby where this conference is taking place. So my reading of this is something that sounds to me like a description that somebody who wasn't coming from our present culture, but basically thinking the way a scientist thinks, would talk about nature, that it's something that follows methods and laws, and that verification, which is essentially experimentation, doing testing, and showing that there's some kind of reliability to the effects of what you do, is present in your practice. So I very much look at Oriental medicine as a science. That doesn't exclude that there's an art of practice. The same thing could be said of Western medicine. Western medicine is based on a science, but you have to be an artist to practice it. So it's both an art and a science. And the problem we run into is that people tend to think that science is equivalent to Western science, that there's no possibility of any other understanding of science that doesn't come as a reduction of part of Western science. And my position is that that's very invidious, is very destructive to empowering people who practice Oriental medicine, because science is a very valuable tool for helping us learn about nature, about the world. And if we allow the Western definition of science to be the only thing that fits that nomenclature, we've lessened our stature. So part of my presentation is going to be trying to look at what are the roots of Oriental medical thinking. And if I could have the next slide. This is just going over Prescott's translation. This is the character Yan, or it's either Yan or Yen, depending on which transliteration system you use. But it is quite an interesting character here. You see that on the left side is a horse, and Prescott interprets it as three people looking at a horse. So these are the two eyes, two mouths talking, they're discussing this horse here, two mouths, and he interprets this third thing as a third mouth. To me, that's more like a unity, but I come to the same conclusion as he does, which is that it's suggesting a consensual process, which again is what science is about. Science isn't about an individual saying, I know this to be true. It's a group of people agreeing that we know this to be true because we can reproduce it. We can share it with each other. What I know is transmissible to you so that you can do it also. I think that's a hallmark of science. Next slide. So this character actually originally had two different forms, and this is from Matthews, which is I think the best English dictionary for looking at Chinese characters. And again, it's just to verify or examine something. And the original character is that Andy Prescott showed as this one, but there was another form of it, which is this one. And the reason that I'm showing you this slide is the difference between these two is in the radical. This has the heart radical down here, and this other one doesn't have the heart radical. They're just two different forms of the same character. The heart radical is going to come up in a number of different Chinese words that I'm going to be discussing today, and it's my way of trying to make my presentation fit the theme of this conference, which is spirit, because the heart is the house of the spirit. And I'm hoping that if I can get through all these slides and make my presentation complete, you'll see why it's really from the very beginning, the spirit is at the root of the scientific approach to understanding nature and to be able to treat people with acupuncture. Okay, next one. So a question for all of you is, do you think that there is a fundamental and practical concept that underlies all of traditional Oriental medicine, or is it just a panoply of a whole bunch of different ideas that don't have some common underlying principle? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah.
Rhythms.
Rhythms, okay. It's an interesting one. She is the one that I was expecting everybody to say, and actually I had a debate with Elizabeth Rochat about whether that was the best one to use. Let me have the next slide. These are the ones that are usually spoken of, the Tao, Yin Yang, Qi, Wu Xing, or something else, which rhythms would fit into. And I'm going to propose that I think the best one to use is this something else. And the reason for that is that there actually is there are two reasons. The first of which is that there is a classical basis for it, that there's a scriptural basis in the Chinese classical texts for what is the point of view of Oriental medicine. And the second is, and this is one that's much more arguable, that if what we want to do is establish that Oriental medicine is scientifically based, do we want to pick a concept like qi, which would be my second choice? Do we want to pick qi, which is so difficult to even define in terms of its breadth of meanings, that it would be almost impossible for me, at least, to figure out a way that I could back up an argument that Oriental medicine is scientific by using qi as the underlying concept that unifies it. So let's look at the next slide. What I'm going to use as the unifying concept is, as the name of this talk has been publicized, is resonance. So resonance, for me, the term that I use is ganying. And it's interesting that even the English translation resonance did not appear in almost any of the English language textbooks about Chinese medicine or other versions of Oriental medicine. Joseph Needham talked about correlative or coordinative thought. Paul Unshold talked about systematic correspondence. So implicitly, I think they're referring to resonance when they use those terms, but they didn't specifically talk about the word resonance. The only place that it did turn up in the literature search that I did was in Maciocha's book, Foundations of Chinese Medicine, which was in 1989, where he actually, and we'll look at that in a minute, he uses the word resonance. That's not actually all that important. It's just interesting to me what choices people make. Manfred Porkert chose inductive synthesis, and if you think about these three possibilities for choosing correlative coordinative thought, systematic correspondence, or inductive synthesis, which of the three has the most flavor of being scientific? I think it's pretty clear it's inductive synthesis, and Porkert actually goes into quite a bit of detail about claiming that Chinese medicine is a science, whereas Needham and Unshold, as brilliant as both of them are, need, I think, a counterbalance. I have an article that came out recently in the Journal of Chinese Medicine that was an answer to an interview with Paul Unshold that they printed in a previous issue, in which I challenged some of Unshold's assertions. And the reason for that is Unshold's use of the word systematic correspondence and Needham's use of correlative or coordinative thought are basically attempts to say that Oriental medicine is a pre-scientific or magical form of thinking, in which you can call it homeopathic magic, like influences like, that that this represents an earlier stage in human understanding of nature, and that now that we've come into the modern realm, we know better and we can be more exact. I want to take issue with that very strongly, that that's exactly the mistake that's being made, that thinking that inductive synthesis is less scientific than deductive analysis is ridiculous. They're just two different ways of looking at the world. And we have to do a much more explicit analysis, which I'll try to get into later a little bit, of what is the nature of science, what makes something a science. Okay, next one. So this is from Maciocia. He said, the ancient Chinese philosophers saw the link among apparently unrelated phenomena as a kind of resonance amongst them. Various different phenomena would be unified by an indefinable common quality, much as two strings would vibrate in unison. This two strings vibrating in unison, we're going to see later, is a very ancient quotation from various Chinese texts. It's in every classical Chinese text that I can think of, going back, actually, I think all the way to the I Ching. And we'll come back to that later. And one of the most typical aspects of Chinese medicine is the common resonance among phenomena in nature and in the human body. So Maciocia was, I think, really out there with putting resonance forth as the underlying fundamental concept. Next one. When I began my research into trying to figure out where this common thread of thought came from, I had already gotten to the point, which started with my investigations that led to Footsteps, which is basically a history book, with the idea that there are many strands that contributed to the development of Oriental medicine. And even today, I think most people, pretty much when you say Oriental medicine, most people don't even use that term. They say Chinese medicine, and for them, it's China is it. People who have a little bit more knowledge will talk about Oriental medicine, and by that, they usually include Japan and Korea, maybe Vietnam. And I was guilty of that same thing until I got to the point in my own studies where I realized that there was something in Ayurvedic medicine from India that I needed to know more about, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit. So I began studying with an Ayurvedic pulse diagnostician, and through that process, it dawned on me that I was being very narrow in my own understanding, and that actually Oriental medicine includes the medicine from India and all the other countries along the Silk Road, which was operative around the same time that the formative ideas of Chinese medicine were being developed. So let's take a look at the next slide. This is the Ouroboros, which goes back to the Egyptians, and maybe even back further to the Babylonians and the Sumerians. It's common to Greece, to China, India, Japan, the Middle East, Romans, and Native Americans. And actually, I think it's probably a very fundamental human observation that nature has certain consistencies that include the dictum, as above, so below, which we know in Chinese medicine comes out in so many different ways. Heaven and earth, heaven, man and earth, yin and yang. This Ouroboros, for me, always brings me back to my first publication, which was Closing the Circle, that basically this idea that the circle has something about it that is conclusive. It doesn't, it can look like it has a beginning and an end, but it really doesn't. It's always continually going around and around and around. And if you twist this circle, if you just twist it vertically, you'll get a figure eight that will look like this, kind of this shape, which shows heaven above and earth below. But if then you just rotate it horizontally 180 degrees, you get this sign for infinity, which is like that. This is, I think, a very common ancient understanding of the nature of reality. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah.
If it's a symbol that's common across all those cultures, does that imply transmission of knowledge across all those cultures?
No, I don't think so. I think that there are many different ways that common themes can occur. Some are by convergence, and some by parallel development. And I think it's entirely possible that, for instance, Egyptian development was a parallel to what was going on in other places, or in Native American. I'm not ruling out the possibility of common origin, but I don't know enough to be able to document that. But I can document that all the countries along the Silk Road were in communication far back enough to justify saying that the fundamental ideas behind Chinese medicine were known to all of these other cultures. Okay? So the doctrine of signatures also fits in. This is an example of, again, homeopathic thinking, that if something looks like a certain shape, like a kidney bean, it probably has some relationship to the physical kidney, which looks like it in the human body. And as we're going to see, since the topic of this speech is about resonance, there's a reason why things that have the same shape have an impact on other things that have the same shape. And that means we're going to have to look at what is resonance. Okay, next. So in ancient Greek philosophy, which was part of what went along that Silk Road, there were a number of interesting ideas. Anaximander talked about the limitless, and the limitless, as you know, in Chinese medicine, starts from, if you look at any of the Taoist classics, that originally there's, well, we'll get to this in a minute, but there's wuji, which means without any pole, without any manifestation. And Pythagoras said, okay, that's without, there is the limitless, but there's also the world of things that are limited. And his philosophy evolved from his followers into two schools of thought. One was called the mathematikoi, which dealt with numbers, and the other was called the akousmatikoi, which dealt with sounds. Numbers and sounds are, again, very much part of the scientific side of looking at nature. They're not part of any kind of airy-fairy stuff. They're very concrete. And the other thing about Pythagoras that's interesting is that he recognized that just dealing with the limitless and the limited, so we could talk about heaven and earth, right? Heaven is limitless, earth is limited in Chinese medicine, needed a third term in order for manifestation. Exactly the same idea as in Chinese medicine. Heaven and earth are necessary for man to come into existence. Man is the representative of the 10,000 things in creation. So these are exactly parallel ideas that existed in ancient Greece and in ancient Chinese medicine. And the other interesting, I mean, Pythagoras was just one of these people who were really undervalued now, I think, in terms of history. He called this third term that made heaven and earth, or limitless and limited, able to manifest harmony, which again is, you know, the goal that all of these us as practitioners are looking for in trying to work with our clients, is bring things into harmony so that the person isn't too yang or too yin or too hot or too cold or too wood or too earth or whatever. And finally, his symbol of his school was the pentagram, which very interesting for people from the five-element background, but the word in Greek for the pentagram that he was talking about was hygeia, which is also the word for health. So this harkens back to what Nora was saying in her keynote address, that within just the five-element little segment of traditional acupuncture, you have a complete system for achieving balance and health. Philo of Alexandria came a little bit later, and the reason I'm adding him in this sequence is he said things of the same number are related or in sympathy. So this is really where the resonance starts to come in, is that there's a relationship among things of different, they can be even of different categories, but if they have the same number, coming back to Pythagoras and his school of numbers, okay, the mathematical, if they have the same number, there's something about them that is a relationship of sympathy that leads to an ability for them to interact. And it's interesting that our Western scientific terminology essentially stems from Greek. So, one of the amazing things for me is that, Western medicine pushes so hard on how scientific they are, and when you go back to the roots of science in Greece, actually they're probably closer to Oriental medicine's thinking than they are to Western medicine's thinking. Next slide. And this is just reiterating what I said. The Wuji is the zero, no manifestation. The appearance is Tai Chi, which is what I see as the Big Bang. It's when the potential comes into this explosion of everything, something like the Tao, okay? And from that, you get yin and yang, you get the heaven, man, and earth, and the 10,000 things, and that all was happening around the same period in history. Having mentioned Paul Unshold, I just want to stick in one little astuce here, which I find really charming. He made the assertion in his Chinese Journal of Chinese Medicine article that you all know who Qi-Po was, the advisor to the Yellow Emperor in Neijing. It's interesting that Qi-Po doesn't appear in any of the historical works of Chinese literature other than the Neijing. He's not, there are books like the Records of the Great Historian that talk about the early doctors in China. Qi-Po's not in there. And so Unshold's idea was Qi-Po was actually a corruption of the Chinese attempt to say Hippocrates. Hippo was Qi-Po. I think it's an interesting idea. And no way to know, but okay, next slide. So what is science? For me, and again, I'm willing to stick my neck out and say that these are my ideas, and I'm willing to be challenged on them, but I think the essence of science is a system that's logical, internally consistent, reliably demonstrated by experiment, therefore has the ability to predict things, and is not based on theology, which posits a creator who's not bound by the laws of science. So everything that happens has to be within the bounds of what you can look at. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily be able to explain it all, but it doesn't depend on something that, or some force that's outside its own laws. And I think both Western and Oriental medicine meet the first four criteria, and the criterion that is, well, first five criteria, but the criterion that's used in Western medicine to belittle Oriental medicine is their standard, double-blind, randomized, controlled testing stuff, which is ridiculous, because even Western medicine has recognized that the examiner always affects the outcome of any examination. And when you get down to phenomena where you're dealing with individuals rather than statistics of, take 100,000 people, what is most likely to happen, and ask, but what is going to happen in this patient? You can't go by Western science predictions. For instance, say somebody has rheumatoid arthritis. Is the most modern drug for rheumatoid arthritis going to work for this patient? There's not a single doctor in the world that can say yes, because some people don't respond well to a given drug. So there's always that place where sticking this double-blind criterion on for saying something is scientific is where I think the fight has to be taken to establish Oriental medicine as scientific because it doesn't need to go there and shouldn't go there. It's actually against the concepts in Oriental medicine to do a blinded study where the people don't know the people that are actually doing it don't even know what they're doing. So, next slide. I don't want to belabor that. So why am I choosing resonance? Number of reasons. It's an accepted foundational concept both in the Western and Eastern scientific traditions. It's fundamental to, I think, all of the other axioms of traditional Oriental medicine. So as you'll see, yin and yang, the five elements, wu xing, heaven, earth, and man, they're all ways we classify to start with. We classify all the phenomena in nature. We say, whatever it is, that the screen that you're looking at is either a yin or a yang aspect of your perception. The color white is associated with the metal element because metal and white belong to the same category. And belonging to the same category is what resonance is talking about. We'll get to that, but the way that the metal element and white are related is they resonate with each other. So let's go on to the next one.
Here,
Yeah.
say metal and white. If you're challenged, like, how do you know white and metal resonate? What would the answer be?
The answer to that is that from the experience of practitioners who spend their time looking at the color of their patient's expression, this is just one answer, they will validate, as we saw in that second slide, that those people, when treated on metal, have positive results, whereas if you treat them on earth, they won't.
So
It's based on experiment.
saying there's a resonance, and just saying there's an association.
I'm saying there's an association as the first, we'll see later what else is involved in resonance. Resonance has basically two components. One is categorization, which group do we put everything in? And the other is action. What is the effect of one component in a resonant relationship on the other? Okay, so there's two aspects, categorizing and interacting. And we'll get to that. So I hope I'll be able to answer that better. Okay, let's go to the next one. We can skip that one. So the first appearance of what I'm going to call resonance is in the Book of Changes, the I Ching. Says here, this is actually from the first the commentary on the first hexagram, which is, it says here, the master said. The master is Confucius. So this is attributed to Confucius. And the first hexagram says, what's the meaning? The question to Confucius was, what is the meaning of the words under the fifth line? The dragon is on the wing in the sky. It will be advantageous to see the great man. Okay, so
Excuse me.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you lift your microphone up?
Okay.
Thank you.
So Confucius said, notes of the same key respond to one another. Okay, and then I've arrowed here the Chinese character that he used to mean respond. And I want you to look at this character. I'm not going to go into detail about it now, but try to just, you can see there are two parts. There's something on the left and there's something on the right. Okay? I'll tell you what they are just for the moment, but don't worry about it. The left side is Xiang and the right side is Ying. Ying with a G at the end. Okay? So this idea of resonance goes back at least as far as the I Ching, which is the earliest real text that we have in the Chinese classics. Next slide. Next one. Okay. So there are various strands of contribution to resonance theory. I just showed you the one from the Yi Jing. Joseph Needham quoted a 5th century author who wrote, Mr. Yin, a native of Qinzhou, once asked a Taoist monk, what is the fundamental idea of the I Ching? And he answered that it can be expressed in one word, gan. So this is a different word than the Xiang Ying that I just showed you in the I Ching. He's saying that this Taoist is saying that there is a deeper, if you will, or more coherent concept underlying the commonly used word at that time for resonance, which was Xiangying, which is gan. And the actual term that I use, that I showed at the beginning of this presentation, is Ganying, which is now the most commonly used Chinese translation, or Chinese version of resonance. That's the word you pick if you want to say things are resonant. Chuangzi talked about it, and I alluded to earlier about strings that vibrate together, so that was in Chuangzi. It's in Huainanzi, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, this is a Taoist text. The naturalists, which are the school, the Zhuyan school of, it was called the Yin-Yang school, but he was the first one to really talk about five-element theory in terms of it being a useful model. Major quoted him, Huainanzi quoted Su Yan, the founder of the naturalist school, as, in talking about Huainanzi, saying the question is, how do these effects come about in the absence of mathematical or mechanical links among the things in a single category, right? So that's basically kind of what John was asking. And Su Yan said, and his school, that things in a category, so things in the sand, this category is an important word to remember. That's lei. It's the lei of the Lei Jing, which is the classic of categories, very important text in Chinese medical history, vibrate resonantly together and do so through the medium of qi, which is an invisible, ethereal, vibrational substance that permeates the universe. So what I wanted to show in this slide simply is that although gan is not actually in the text of the Book of Changes, it's cited as the basic idea behind the Book of Changes. Next slide. How did I get started on this whole thing? Actually, I got started in this by Peter Firebrace, who published an article in the IROM journal back in 1989 that I happened to read, which was called Ganying, and has as its subtitle Resonance. And this is a very interesting article because it's the first, as I said, it's the first time I came across resonance as something to think about in Chinese medicine. But also, this was at a time when Peter and I were both studying with Per Lar, learning to read about Chinese characters. And if you look at the character that appears next to Ganying here, this isn't Ganying. This is that character that I just showed you a few minutes ago from the I Ching that was Xiangying. Okay, so it took me a long time to puzzle out what was going on here because he's titling it with something that doesn't fit, doesn't match the character. The reason for that turns out to be that the Ganying and Xiangying are so similar in meaning that they're used synonymously in Chinese, and he just happened to have picked the wrong synonym, but they really mean the same thing. However, it's important for all of you because, at least for those of you who are in the five-element tradition, you should know this character Xiang, which is the first word in what we talk about as the sheng cycle, the production cycle, and the control cycle. It's called xiang sheng or xiang ke, means mutual, doesn't mean cycle at all. So actually, talking about the production cycle or the shen cycle is actually bad Chinese language. It doesn't mean cycle, it means mutual, meaning goes both ways. A influences B, B influences A. It's not implying a cyclical movement. So it really means mutual, and we'll get into what yin is, but very interesting. Okay, next slide. Halfway, okay. Okay, so Xiang is a great example. This is from Viga, this is how Perlar taught me to read Chinese, and I'm far from expert at it, but I encourage everybody to try to learn, because it's not all that hard to learn enough to make sense of things. Viga explains Xiang as mutual, well, it's first to examine and inspect, and he says the usual abstract meaning of reciprocity, which is the mutual business, comes from the fact that on the left is wood and on the right is I, which are both pronounced mu in Chinese. And so he's saying it came from a pun on the phonetic, on the sound of these characters. But actually, if he had known Chinese medicine, as all of you do, you would know that there's a lot more going on here, because wood and the I are resonant phenomena. It's not that they happen to sound the same, it's that they have an intrinsic relationship to each other. Next slide. So the point I wanted to make about the production cycle and the control cycle is just that it goes both ways. We're taught it in school that it's a clockwise movement, but there are traditions of oriental medicine where you use the son to tonify the mother. A good example of that is in the Dong system from Taiwan, Master Dong, that Richard Tan teaches, uses the spleen to tonify the heart. And there are many. The Koreans use it, the Japanese use it. So Oriental medicine has recognized that reverse direction of these things, because they don't consider them cycles. They're mutually affecting relationships. Okay, so Firebrace's source for resonance was Huainanzi, which was a text that's in the Taoist tradition, and he got it from a translation of chapter 6 by one of Perlar's students. And chapter 6, as we'll see, is the locus classicus. That means the place where resonance theory was originally described in Chinese medicine. Okay, next slide. And this is the history of the Huainanzi. We don't need to stay on that. Next slide. Okay, so we have two terms for resonance, Ganying and Xiangying. And I think of, like Firebrace said, I think of Ganying as the word, but they're kind of similar. So given what I've told you, how often do you think Ganying appears in the classical text, the Neijing and the Nanjing? Any guesses? Twice. Very close. 0. I didn't know, so I asked Dan Bensky, who's a friend, and Dan has a computer program that can search for any term in the classical texts. And so I said, plug in Ganying and tell me how often it appears. I'm curious. And so next slide. So this was his answer to me. First of all, that no Ganying doesn't happen at all. Xiangying, yes. And Xianggan, yes, but not Ganying. So Xiang is a very important concept. We already talked about that, meaning mutual. Ying is very common, and it means to correspond here, as in a pulse corresponding to a symptom. Like if you're uptight, you probably have constrained wood energy, liver qi. That's an example of correspondence. Whereas Gan, usually in the Neijing, means to contract. And actually, in Chinese medicine, we have a patent medicine called Gan Mao Ling that's used for treating the colds or flus that people catch, with the idea it's like catching the cold devil. So catching is an important aspect of what Gan involves. And the reason it's important to keep this in mind is that to catch something is implying an action, whereas the classifications I talked about before, resonance, there are two ideas. One is the categorization of phenomena. It's either yin or it's yang, and the other is the action between them. What effect does yin have on yang? And Gan is what brings the idea of effects into play here. So I don't want to go through this whole thing because it's complicated, and I'm sure most of you don't read Chinese. So next. Okay, Nanjing 13 says the five viscera have the respective corresponding voice, facial color, smell, and flavor, which should correspond to the pulse at the wrist and the skin along the ulna. If not, it means the presence of disease. So the reason I stuck this one in is people are always asking for, what's the classical source for the three legs of the stool or the four legs of the stool in five-element acupuncture? Well, here it is in Nanjing. It's color, sound, odor. The only one that's different is they have flavor instead of emotion. But, that's being picky to say it doesn't have a classical basis because one of the four, they picked a slightly different category to focus on for diagnosis. It's quite clear that this approach to diagnosis is rooted in the classics. Next. Okay, do I want to talk about this? I'm going to start here with Huainanzi chapter 6, and because this is the most important part. It's the mutual response, which in this chapter is, the Chinese term is Ganying. The mutual response of things belonging in the same category, again that same word lei, is darkly mysterious and extremely subtle. Knowledge cannot explain it, nor discussion unravel it. Each thing is affected, and again here's Gan, which I pointed out before, a minute ago, was bringing in the aspect of affecting things. Each thing is affected in as much as it resembles or partakes of the shapes and categories, again lei, of other things. Okay, this is just a quotation from chapter 6, next, of Huainanzi. Okay, so Gan, Matthew's defined as moved to response through the feelings and affections, and also as induction. And he's got this scientific sounding word in there. What I wanted to point out in here is the radical in here, again the heart radical. So all of the terms that are significant in what I'm going to say this afternoon have the heart radical in there. And by citing feelings and affections, Matthews is foreshadowing my thesis that resonance and spirit are related concepts because they both have to do with the role that the heart is playing in these situations. Next. And again, this is the Chinese character for Gan, which involves the heart. It actually started off with an actual picture of a human heart as its center. I don't think we need to go into detail about that. Okay, next. So Gan is used in common expressions in Chinese, like emotional, to move the hearts of men, to act the response of the gods to good works, induction. I talked about the medical use of it already. We talked about catching cold as ganxie, catching an evil, and I'll talk about evils tomorrow with possession. And the Neijing in that part that I showed you that Dan Bensky emailed me uses Gan in an affected way to talk about things like heaven and earth Gan each other. So they don't resonate. Heaven doesn't resonate with the earth. It affects earth. They're polar opposites like yin and yang. Yin and yang aren't resonant categories. They're opposite categories. So within yin, we have a whole bunch of resonances, and within yang, we have a whole bunch of resonances, and they mutually interact with each other, which is the way the Neijing used the word gan. Okay, next. Yin, on the other hand, means something like ought to, should, must, right, or proper, or fitting. But the real meaning of it here is, according to a further definition, is respond, echo, correspond. So correspondence and resonance are very similar concepts, and so Xiang Ying and Gan Ying are almost identical in meaning as words for things that resonate together. And again, if we look at the character, the heart radical, same thing again. Next slide. Okay, so this yin comes from a short-tailed bird, which is the phonetic part of the character. The phonetic part of the character is a short-tailed bird that gives yin its sound. And next slide. Probably doesn't show up in this lighting too well, but so let's go to the next slide. This is a stone carving from China, and you'll recognize this was in Joseph Needham's book on science and civilization in China originally. The original acupuncturists were thought of as birdmen. So there's actually a connection between the word yin, which comes from a kind of bird, and acupuncture that is symbolized in this picture of a practitioner who's half bird, half man, sticking a needle, about to stick a needle in somebody. And by the strangest coincidence of all, the nickname of J.R. Worsley when he was a practitioner was the feather, because of the lightness of his touch in treating people. I always found that amusing. Okay, next slide. So the meaning of this is literally yin was this component was a falcon, which responds to, it's a bird that man trains and responds to him. But what did I want to say about this? We talked about the heart radical and the idea of phonetics. The idea in yin is not just so much responding, but it's responding quickly. And there's something about the birds that if you look at a bird, I think most people will agree with me that of all the creatures, a bird symbolizes a sudden movement. You think of a hummingbird's wings, for instance, beating incredibly fast that you can't even see them while they're in motion. And the idea behind yin is that this correspondence is so fast that for all intents and purposes it's instantaneous. And that's an important part of the concept of resonance, is that it's something that doesn't take any time. So it's also something that I think you probably experience in practice. When you put a needle in somebody, you can go right to their pulse and feel, did this pulse change or didn't it? You don't have to wait 20, 30 minutes to see. I mean, there are situations where you do need to do that, but in many situations, and I've certainly experienced this myself thousands of times, there's no time in between that I have to wait for to go back if I've chosen the point correctly. If I put the needle in and I go back and feel the pulse, it's changed. So that's an important part of what's going on in resonance theory. Next one. And just fill this slide up. Next, one more. That's it. No, go back one. Okay. So yin is used in phrases like should at once, it's my duty, respond without the slightest hesitation. It's all about speed, obeying, to be in harmony with men. Phrases like the clocks all struck at the proper time, meaning they were tuned or synchronized, which is this idea of tuning, has a lot to do with what we do in acupuncture and resonance treatments, that we're treating our patients to be in proper tune. And one of the ideas I really like is when we stick a needle in a point, what we're doing is reminding that person's body, mind, spirit of what their original nature was, that point, the spirit of that point holds that information for that person and allows them to retune themselves. And it's not anything we're doing to them, we're just helping them remember. Okay, next one. We don't have to go over that. Next one. Okay, stop. So what is Gan Ying? Matthews defines it as move to response through the feelings or induction. LeBlanc translated it as resonance, as I do, but also as stimulus and response, which is a more scientific kind of terminology, not necessarily than resonance, but then some other people's translations. Turk Bodhi translated it as action and reaction. All of these are kind of scientifically acceptable languages. But Huainanzi warns us, and as I read to you before, that attempting to understand the mechanism, this is going back to what John asked before, attempting to understand the mechanism of how Ganying does what it does, how does resonance work, is fruitless. Quite clear, it says, knowledge cannot explain it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't ponder the mystery, but there's some things that we're just not going to get an answer to. Yeah.
So just on that, then that would be radically unscientific, wouldn't it? To posit. So if we have like the idea of gravitation, if you were to say in science, oh well, we won't look into what gravitation is all about, that would be radically unscientific.
No. I think you're misunderstanding the implication. It's not saying don't look for it. It's just saying you ain't going to find it. It may actually be very good for you to look for it for your own development. And that is actually the nature, I think, of scientific pursuit. There's always something that we don't know. There's always something behind the next step. Western science hasn't found the ultimate nature of reality.
No, but if we posit a mechanism and say there is such a mechanism and it's resonance, and if we then say it's fruitless to look into what that mechanism is, that would be considered radically and unscientific. So if we're going to make a parallel between Oriental medicine and the scientific endeavour, that's something that will need work on.
Yes, yeah, it's an interesting question, and I understand why you would say that. My own way of thinking is that I think Western science also comes to very similar ideas about, for instance, in quantum mechanics, that until an event occurs, there's no way to predict exactly what the outcome is going to be, that no matter how you try to investigate that, you will not be able to explain it because it doesn't actually occur until it's occurred.
So yeah, as an ex-physicist myself, actually, so the thing is, yes, you might come to that interim conclusion, but you'd always be then wanting to ask the question, you know, how does that work? And continuing with quantum mechanics, you know, that has been done.
Yes, and like I said before, I think it's actually good for the character development of all of us to ponder the mystery of how does this work, even if it turns out that we can't answer it, because that's what ultimately I think is going to bring us to the second part of my talk, which is how does this relate to spirit, to the heart, which again is, you know, this is the area that's quite outside the realm of Western medicine. Western medicine just doesn't deal with spirit at all. Yeah. Okay. So if it's true what Huainanzi says about the fruitlessness of trying to ask how this happens, I was saying that I still think we should ponder the mystery and ask ourselves, why is the heart radical in the terms both yin and gan, and in the other places that I showed you before, and many other, all the spirit. Elizabeth just talked about the yi and the zhi today in the last talk, both of which have the heart radical. Almost all of the terms that relate to the level of spirit have the heart radical in them, and that's the mystery, is what is the heart actually all about? What is it doing, and what is the spirit? So the fact that gan and yin both have this heart radical in it leads me to the conclusion that it's intimately intertwined with our understanding of spirit, that it clearly has something to do with the heart. We don't know exactly what, but it really opens up for me an enormous area of understanding nature, because even we like to think of the heart as being part of the animal kingdom, at least if not restricting it to man when we're talking about spiritual issues. But actually, resonance theory applies to everything. It doesn't apply even just to animals and plants. It also applies to the mineral kingdom, to everything in nature. And the elements are not restricted to the level of human beings, and they are part of the reality of resonance, which is gan yin and is based on the heart radical. So there is something about spirit that seems to me is imperatively connected to how we all ought to be orienting ourselves towards Oriental medicine's fundamental assumptions about reality, that there's something in there that is beyond our comprehension, but not beyond our experience. Okay? All of us have experienced spirit, every single one of us in this room. None of us, I think, can, in words, really tell anybody else what it is that they've experienced about spirit. And that's basically, I think, what the Tao Te Ching is saying about the Tao, that as soon as you open your mouth, you're wrong. You can't talk about it, but it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that's sort of what I'm pointing at with this idea that I think Huainanzi was pointing to, is that there are some things that are just beyond the realm of discourse. It doesn't mean they're beyond the realm of reality, though. Next. Okay, so Huainanzi 6 is LeBlanc translated as peering into the obscure. And the idea that resonance occurs, at least implicitly, in all 21 chapters of Huainanzi. It's assumed here that it was around the idea of resonance that the philosophy of Huainanzi was elaborated. But chapter 6, which is in Chinese Lanming Shun, which he's translating as peering into the obscure, was devoted explicitly to this idea of resonance. And what I'm going to try to propose is that I think there's a better translation of this Chinese terminology than peering into the obscure. So Lan means to look at, to inspect, to perceive. It's got an eye here. This is the Chinese character for an eye. Next one. Ming means dark, obscure, the unseen world. Interesting here, this is a cover. This on the bottom is the Chinese term for 6. And in the middle is the sun. So the sun is covered up for 6 Chinese hours, double hours every day, which is nighttime. That's when it's dark, obscure, the unseen world, the underworld. Okay, don't confuse it. Ming is a very common Chinese word, and there are so many different Mings. This is the particular one that means dark, and it's actually in that sense opposite to the Ming, for instance, of Yang Ming, and in many ways maybe different than the Ming of Ming Mun, which are common Chinese medical terms. Next one. Okay, this is just the explanation I gave you about the 6 double hours. The next one. And shun means to instruct or to advise or to counsel. So I would like to propose that rather than peering into the obscure, that just looking at those 3 Chinese terms, Lan Ming Shun, you could, I think, reasonably translate them as advice on perceiving the unseen world, which is, I think, what resonance is about. It's advice on understanding, perceiving, being able to recognize what is going on that maybe we can't see directly, but we can certainly observe the effects of it. And that's, I think, what we deal with in acupuncture is we don't see the mechanism of how we're accomplishing our effects. What we see is the results of what we do. And whether we're coming from a Worsleyan tradition of emotion testing, where we try to provoke a certain response in the patient, the only thing we see is whether what we did has an effect on the person. We don't see the mechanism by how it's happening, anything traveling through the ether, as it were. So the reason I like this is advice on perceiving the unseen world could very well have been a treatise by somebody in the 1700s who was, discovered a microscope or something and said, there are things that we can see that we didn't even know were there before. It's kind of, for me, has the feeling of this is the way a scientist would talk, that there are things in nature that we haven't seen before. Maybe we can see them, maybe we can't. I would like to talk to you about what we know about those things. And what he had to say about them was that resonance, like things of the same shape and form, we'll go over that again, I think, influence each other. They resonate with each other. And that we can use this in our understanding of nature and as healers in our work with our patients. Okay, next one. Okay, so again, the mutual response of things belonging to the same category is darkly mysterious and extremely subtle. Knowledge can't explain it or discussion unravel it. And next slide. It says that each thing is affected inasmuch as it partakes of the shape and category of other things. So basically what it's saying is that things in the same category affect each other. So, without explaining the answer to John's question about white and metal, it's giving a, what's the word I'm searching for? It's giving a language that I think is very clearly the underpinning of the way of thinking in Oriental medicine, that to simply talk about qi misses. When we talk about qi, it's so broad a term that it can mean anything. But when we talk about resonance and get it down to the 2 basic concepts of things in the same category relate to each other and affect each other. Okay? They're affected and they share categories. Okay, next one. All right. I'm not going to go into all of the other terms in this part. Let me just see are there any other questions meanwhile? Because we're we're supposed to take a little break at some point. Yeah.
Clearest models of resonance is one guitar string affects another one.
Right.
And somehow you can feel that, and it's like, I'm sort of sympathetic with the question here about, don't you ever get to understand the resonance and so on? And
Well, we can understand it in terms of guitar strings and acoustics. We have
Yeah.
scientific models for that. But when you ask the question, why does a certain musical note relate to one of the elements? I don't think that there's an answer to that you're going to come up with. Maybe you do. I don't. It's basically the same question you asked about why is white associated with the metal element.
yeah, I've sat in a group of about 8 or 10 other metalsmiths, and I looked around and I thought, yeah, there was something about what I perceived or felt. And so the word feel is almost tempts me to think, yeah, you can feel the rest.
Yeah, and that's what what I'm saying is I think it can be experienced. That's what I said about Shem, spirit. These are real aspects of nature, but that doesn't mean that we can explain them. We can experience. There's a difference between experience and explanation. So I agree with you. Yes, experience, we can all share that we've had a certain experience and validate it that way, which is why I think it is still scientific, because it's a validatable phenomenon. But being able to explain it isn't necessarily the criterion for calling it scientific or unscientific.
If you've got a moment, I'll just throw something else in. If you're not so worried about what's in there and what's out there in terms of whether it's just an organisational principle of the human mind that we're talking about, or whether you're talking about what's really out there in reality. So maybe like the 5 elements or whatever are more about the way that we as human beings can perceive the world. So if you're not if you don't make such a clear division between the subjective and the objective, which in science, in modern science we also see that actually it's how we decide to divide up the world, which is part of our scientific theories, in as much as as well as what's actually out there. If you take that parallel and you say, well, okay, there are the 5 elements, and in a sense they're really out there, but in a sense they're also the way that the human mind starts to divide things up, then you can get quite a bit of traction there. It's kind of like being sort of bringing out the comparison. Does that make sense? It's okay. That's a bit of
Cause and effect is not necessarily out there, but we have a
for
predisposition
instance,
to it.
and our categorization of the world is, I think.
The problem I have with that is I don't think that that a human interpretation is necessary for these phenomena to exist. That things resonantly affect each other. It's like the question of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound?
That's just because you're at heart, you're a scientific realist, you see. In spite of everything, you're more of a realist than I am.
Okay.
So you really want the world out there to be really there and to be quite independent of our thinking.
Yes, I want the world to be real.
Yeah, you and Einstein both.
Yes, I'm in good company, I think. Yeah, that doesn't. But again, that doesn't mean that. I'm just repeating myself, but it doesn't mean that we can explain everything that we experience. I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of the wonders of life, is how much of it is beyond what we can explain or sometimes even talk about, and that each of us has our own individual experience of what it is to be alive and what we think of the outside world. And we may, what I think is out there may be very different than what you think is out there, and that's okay with me. I don't insist that anybody else think that what's out there is the same as what I think is out there. I just want them to entertain the idea that there are certain reliably reproducible phenomena in the world that are better dealt with by concepts in Oriental medicine than by concepts in Western medicine. And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this is that we can now expand it into homeopathic medicine, which is essentially like, it's the whole idea of like affects like as the basis for it, which is no different than resonance theory. And as you know, in classical homeopathy, there are three kingdoms. There's animal remedies, there's vegetable remedies, and then there's this, probably maybe even the biggest group of mineral remedies that have, and if you look at what are the indications for the mineral remedies, the most important indications are emotional and experiential effects in human beings. So if these remedies have these natures, do they only have them because human beings evolved or live on this planet to be able to experience them? Or is this something that's actually inherent in minerals themselves? And are, in some sense, minerals alive? Do the minerals have spirit? I think this is, to me, one of the most intriguing concepts that my attempts to understand the resonance ideas behind Oriental medicine brings up, which is spirit is everything. Spirit is all-pervading. Spirit is, I think, at that level of zero, of the absolutely unmanifest. I think it says this in a number of places in the classics, that it's as soon as you start to talk about spirit, it disappears. You can't point to it. It's nothing you can see, but all of a sudden the clouds lift and you know it's there. So you can. It's saying it again, the same thing as I said before. You can experience it, but you can't point to it and define it. You can't. And I think that it is. Because of the implications of what I've said already, I think that it does pervade all of nature, which is mind-boggling to me, to begin to think that, it's not just human beings that have spirit, and it's, so we think about it's wrong to kill, we shouldn't take life needlessly. It's wrong to kill people. Well, a lot of people think it's wrong to kill animals for any reason. We shouldn't eat meat. We should all be vegetarians. Other people think we shouldn't eat vegetables. That they're saying there are studies that plant life also has the ability to communicate and send messages back and forth and experience things. So what happens when we kill them? And if you extend that logically, what are we doing when we use minerals for all our various things, including blowing things up? It's a tremendously interesting concept, and I probably won't have enough to, I don't know if I'll have enough to finish all the time that's allotted to me for the second half of this, but I want to get into that aspect of how does resonance connect to the idea of the topic of this weekend, which is Shen. And I laid the groundwork for it here by showing that resonance, I think, is very clearly the fundamental organizing idea behind the various theories of Oriental medicine, and that implicit in resonance is the heart radical. You can't get away from it, and that there is something about what the human heart is able to experience that allows us to experience resonance even if we can't explain it. So are we kind of a little bit? Okay, so let's spend this 5 minutes on question, because I don't want to get into the second half yet.
It's interesting that in homeopathic medicine, the more dilute and therefore the less tangible the remedy becomes, the more it touches the spirit.
Yes.
So, I really enjoyed that, feeling that resonance, if you like, between
Exactly. Yeah.
the energetic medicine.
Yeah, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with some of the newer developments in homeopathy, but there's an Indian homeopath, Rajan Sankaran, who's taken homeopathy, I think, to a whole new level that deals with what he calls the second song, that there is an energy which, actually this connects more with what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, the idea of possession, but that there is an energy that the remedies are able to evoke that is what is getting in the way of us being in contact with our own original nature. And that the way to find that energy is by honing the interview with the client over and over again so that you get as pure an experience as possible. You know, we're all used to our clients coming in and telling us, I have a pain in my shoulder, or my digestion is unstable, I'm constipated, or God knows what. There are a million symptoms that people have. But when you ask them, well, describe it to me. Exactly what do you mean when you say, I have a pain in my shoulder? There are a zillion different experiences that people have of shoulder pain. No two are alike. And I did a seminar with Sankaran. I was the only non-homeopath in the room. It was quite an interesting experience. What he does is he's relentless. He won't stop with, when they say, okay, it's in this spot and it feels like a nail is sticking in me. Well, what does a nail sticking in you feel like? This is almost like you're going to a Freudian analyst and saying, yes, and what does that feel like? And what does that feel like? And he keeps on going through this process till he gets the most primitive expression of an experience. And that primitive experience is the essence of the remedy, which will be found in one of the three kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, or animal. And I make reference to this in my book that just came out this year that I find very interesting. I think there are cases I've had where I've been a little bit stuck with some of my patients about their diagnosis, and thinking about the nature of the remedies from Sankaran's point of view of, are they basically mineral, which has to do with structure? So, our bodies are built of various chemical components which form a structure around which we organize ourselves. And people that experience their symptoms as essentially structural problems, which usually are expressed something like, I'm not strong enough to deal with this situation. There's something wrong. I'm impotent with my wife. Why are you impotent? I don't know. It's just, I guess nature didn't give me the ability to be sexual. My back hurts. Why does your back hurt? Well, I've always had a bad back. I think I inherited it from my father. That's that kind of thinking. There's something about my structure that's fallible. Those people need mineral remedies. People who come in and say, I have headaches, doctor, can you help me with them? Well, why do you think you have headaches? Well, I don't know, but every time I go out in the wind, that's when it happens. I'm just really sensitive to the wind. So what Sankaran discovered is that people who describe their maladies as I'm sensitive to something in the world are basically talking about the way plants experience reality. Minerals experience reality as structures. They build things. Plants experience reality as temperament, as being affected by things. Can I grow in this climate? No, this is not a proper climate for this plant to grow in. It has to be a tropical climate. It's not going to grow in San Francisco. And then the third category are people who experience their symptoms as something did it to me. You know, why do you have stomach aches? Because my husband is such a bastard. Every time he comes home, the first thing he does, he comes through the door, he goes for a bottle of beer, and he plunks in front of the television, and he doesn't care at all about my day. You know, he's totally in his own little world. He's doing it to me. And no matter how many times I argue with him about, you know, we have a marriage, you're supposed to pay attention to me, doesn't do any good. Those kind of people need animal remedies where they attribute their problems as coming from somebody else doing something to them, or something else doing something to them. Usually it's somebody else. And so I found with my own patients, and again, just be a very long, drawn-out speech to explain how to include that in acupuncture, but there is enough information on that in my book if somebody's really interested in that, to at least get an idea of how I use that way of thinking. The reason I brought it up is, again, it brings me back to this idea that minerals, plants, and animals all have some kind of thing that, you know, we can call spirit or consciousness or some level of existence beyond what we can measure and study from the classical scientific approach. There is an unseen world that we can investigate and wonder about and use very creatively and very helpfully as human beings. And this unseen world extends far and wide, includes everything in the universe. Okay, any other questions if we have time? It's time? Okay, it's time for a break. We'll see you back here afterwards.